Thank you, everybody. What an honour to have you all join us. So, good morning to you if you're in Australasia. Good afternoon, good evening, good night. It's just wonderful to have you joining us to listen to what Angela and Melanie are going to share with us. If you've not been to one of our evenings before, you are so very welcome. And do please, people are already popping yourselves into the chat to say where you are. And it's wonderful when we read through afterwards to see how widespread we all are gathered here together. It's beautiful. We're going to begin as we usually do, the best possible way, with prayer, moment or two of quiet prayer, and then we'll be welcoming Barbara and Melanie to talk about hope for life and looking what faith can do in the crisis of our earth. This is part of our taking action theme and empowering ourselves. After that, as usual, there'll be time for sharing following their thoughts, for questions, for our responses in the chat as well. So that's very much over to us for the rest of the evening after they've given us their magnificent thoughts. Can we just make clear here, it's not always clear to people, that the views and thoughts that we have here on Root and Branch are a forum. We live in an institution which has very cut and dried ideas about what is acceptable and what isn't. But in Root and Branch, we see the purpose of spirituality as being open and listening and questioning. And I think people sometimes think that Root and Branch thinks this or thinks that, following one particular talk or another. We're a forum because we know that none of us actually has all the answers. So there's a breadth of views here at Root and Branch, and please enjoy. Thank you. Kevin, over to you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. So let us start our event today by remembering that our Creator God is with us in all that we do. God in everyone and God in everything. And perhaps the best way to do this and to experience this is in the language of God, which is silence. So let us come together in this space between us now in 2 minutes of quiet silence. Could all gently just return. As we enter the space, surround us with your love. May we see your beauty, feel your love, know your wisdom, and experience your power. We find in you the comfort that we desire and the strength that we need. And may your presence be with us every hour of this day. And may your love be the passion in our hearts. May your joy be our strength when times are hard. And may your presence be the peace that overflows in our lives. I'll now hand over to Sue with introduction.
We welcome Barbara Wilson and Melanie Nazareth to root and branch as leading climate campaign activists in the Christian Climate Action Group. Barbara has many strings to her bow, including leading walks in Catholic People's Week's retreats. A long history of walking and pilgrimage resulted in her walking to Glasgow from London for COP26 as a witness to the call for action on climate change. As well as being a leader in Catholic People's Weeks, Barbara's been involved in the Southwark Feminist Theology Group, which we have both attended over the years. And Barbara is still involved in her local Roman Catholic parish. Through London Citizens, Barbara led the refugee welcome in Lambeth, which acted as a signpost for refugee action in my own borough of Lewisham. Barbara's parents were Polish refugees, which must have influenced Barbara's own awareness of refugee issues. After a childhood in Hong Kong, her global awareness increased, along with her work for CAFOD as its leading statistician. Barbara's passion for social justice is shown in all in which she is involved, but particularly in her concern for action about climate change. We are very glad you'll be speaking up to us this evening. Again, we welcome you, Barbara. We also welcome Melanie Nazareth, who is part of a small team administrating Christian climate action as its driving force. Melanie has realised that the next generation of her family, which is made up of 4 young adults, have much to face as they live in a climate change world. Kenya was the place of Melanie's birth, although she is of Indian origin. The Solomon Islands were Melanie's childhood home. All these links to areas where climate change has become particularly noticeable led to Melanie realising the need to take action for climate justice. Melanie gave up her career as a lawyer to study theology, ecology, and ethics, and to her becoming active in Christian climate action and Extinction Rebellion. We welcome you, Melanie, as we do Barbara, with much respect.
Greetings, everybody. So here's another picture of me. So just to remind you what I'm like and what my name is. And Sue has very kindly given you a bit of an introduction to myself. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm going to give you essentially my own story, but illustrating it by the kind of work I've been doing with Christian Climate and other climate groups over the last 3 or 4 years. And when we were preparing this talk, I did ask Mary and the others, I'm assuming everybody here is aware that climate change is a really important issue and that it's a good thing to do something about it. So I'm not going to talk at all about why climate action is important, but just, as I say, what kinds of things we might do. So here I am. I'm actually walking along a canal in southern England. And I wanted to if I can get another. There we are. I've been involved in issues to do with Catholic social teaching, with issues to do with the climate for a long, long time. So in the summer of 2020, during the pandemic, Catholic People's Weeks had a week-long conference, and one of the speakers was Melanie, who's the other speaker on this call, and she talked about Christian climate action. And I said to a friend of mine, I think we really ought to find out what this is all about. And we went, and there was a big XR gathering in Parliament Square, which is where we are. You can see we're sitting at the foot of Gandhi, and began to talk to other people that were involved in Christian climate action. Right, if you can move on 2 or 3 after that. Yeah. Okay, so here we are in Parliament Square. And if you do another one after that. And again in Parliament Square. And that was where I began to meet a number of other people who are involved in Christian climate action, including my friend Sue Parfitt, who had just glued herself to the railings outside Parliament Square, outside Parliament. And she was arrested and taken to Walworth Prison, no, Walworth Police Station. And when I got home that night, people were saying, "Oh dear, poor Sue, she's being let out of the police station at 11 o'clock at night. What are we going to do?" So I said, perhaps she should come and stay with me. And she did. And that began a really good friendship. If you could move on again, Peter. So the next thing that happened was that we prayed, CCA pray regularly, and I met a number of people through that, including these two, my friends Ben and Tim. And this is them going into court because they too had glued them. Ben also had glued himself and needed to go to court. And they decided they would do some civil disobedience inside the court. And so here they are going in, glued themselves to the court, which was contempt of court, and they went to prison for a week. Next slide. And during that week, it was just before Easter, it was just before Holy Week, and there was a series of Stations of the Cross. And as I walked around, this is one of them. Ben rang me up to say that he was in prison, he was safe, he and Tim were together. And then the next slide. Here they are out of Wandsworth Prison, which is one of the most horrible prisons in the country, I think. But they're looking pretty cheerful because they've come out of prison. And that helped me realise how important it is to help look after people who are in prison and support them in whatever way you can. So the next slide, this is Tim, who is a dentist, and he did two actions that I was supporting. One was he sewed his lips up to show how important that we were being silenced, and he was against that silence. And then here he is gluing himself to the doors of News Corp, which is where Rupert Murdoch's organisation is, and he is protesting against what Murdoch does do, just telling us that the climate issue is not an important issue. Okay, next slide. And then here is a CCA action. CCA is very definitely non-violent, but it does do some quite dramatic actions. And this, if you might recognise, is St Paul's Cathedral. And here's a group of people with banners saying that the church should divest from fossil fuels. So this is what they did at the very end of the service. They did it very respectfully. The service had finished and they walked up to the front and held up these banners. And then the next thing they knew, which is the next slide, is the police had come in and were arresting them all. So they were taken away very sneakily. The police took them down into the crypt and out and away. So we had no idea where they were. But we did eventually manage to find them. Next slide. Other actions that CCA does are much more peaceful. This is outside Lambeth Palace, where there was a big conference. There is a conference of all the Anglican Communion every decade, and there were people from all over the world, including the bishop that you can see there is from Sudan, and he was very keen that we should save the Sud. And at the very front of the picture with the Christian Climate Action T-shirt on, they'd written to all the bishops that were coming to the conference saying that we wanted to support them, we wanted to find out what was important to them. And this bishop from Sudan had written back and said that the Sud wetland was the thing that he most wanted to do something about in the environment. And so we made him this special banner, and he was really, really delighted that we made this banner. He took it off and wore it for the rest of the conference. Next slide. And then again, later that summer, XR was having a big dramatic kind of action. And the pink thing in the middle, you can see, is the bottom of a table to which we were inviting people to come, and the government ideally to come and talk about climate and the crisis. So at that point, the governmental panel that was meant to be looking at how the government was implementing the Climate Act was saying that the things they were doing were not really adequate, and they wanted to have more action. And so you can see a whole group of my friends from Christian Climate Action. You might recognize that's Melanie at the very bottom here. And they're all wearing CCA t-shirts, which are the XR banner, but with a little cross at the top to show that we are Christians as well. Another thing that happened in that same action was people were locking themselves on in various places. And this is Ben, who was involved in that action earlier on, lying locked on. That's why his left arm is stuck out underneath his lorry, reading, if you can look carefully, reading Gandhi, just to while away the time. And so the next slide is Ben praying in a square. That was a bit later on. And behind him is somebody called Martin Newell, who's a wonderful passionist father, who was one of the founders of Christian Climate Action. So that was a series of actions that were going on mostly in London. And then in 2021, some of you will remember that in October was the Conference of the Parties in Glasgow. And a group of us, including Melanie, decided that we would walk all the way to Glasgow. So we had this big banner, Camino to COP, a pilgrimage for climate justice. And we walked along mostly country kind of routes, but stopped in villages and little towns, and were hosted mostly in churches, sleeping on church floors, sometimes in Quaker meeting houses, and talked to people about climate. And just walking along, we had opportunities to talk to people. So if you do the next couple of slides, Peter, you'll see that's me just walking, and then again, that's us. We found these wonderful haystacks and just had a nice time with the haystacks. And then again, one of the other things was there was a really good opportunities for conversation. And in the back of this picture, you can see a woman with a grey cardigan, and you can just about see her clerical collar. That's Helen Burnett, and a group of young people listening to her talking about all sorts of issues. But many of these young people were not part of CCA, they were not necessarily Christians, but they had lots and lots of questions. And Helen was very good at talking to them and just helping them work through all sorts of issues in their lives. And then the next slide, this is in Coventry, I think. This young woman is from Zimbabwe, and we had a lovely evening with her talking about what things are like in her country. And then this is us almost at Glasgow, this beautiful rainbow. And then the next one, we're walking with Faith Bridge banner. You can just about see me on the right. And the Faith Bridge is from the very, very early XR days when we held one of the bridges over the Thames with a group of faith-based organisations. And the next one is Melanie. We've arrived in Glasgow, and Melanie is wearing something that's the coat of hopes, which if you look at all those little patches, each of those little patches was sewn by somebody expressing their hopes and fears about the climate. And as well as all of us walking, the people walked along, and different people wore it on different days. But it was felt appropriate that Melanie, who helped lead the walk, should lead us into Glasgow wearing this lovely coat. And it was, again, a conversation piece between people. And we had the coat outside. This is the gates of the conference, and we held vigil outside the conference in the daytime and then sometimes in the evenings as well. And we would meet delegates and invite them to wear the coat of hopes and express their hopes and fears about the climate. So it was a really lovely thing to do, to walk. And we had a lot of hope for the conference, but it didn't work as well as it might. But there we are. And then in parallel with that, there was these actions going on with something called Insulate Britain, where people were blocking motorways to raise awareness of the issue that in Britain houses are really poorly insulated, and wanting the government to do something about it. And we had expected that all these people blocking the motorway would be not just arrested, which they were, but remanded. But in fact, what the government did was that the police let them back out, and then they went and sat in the road again. So if you do the next couple of slides, Peter. So there they are with the, you can see this motorway is completely empty. And then the next, that's again, they're sitting, blocking the road. And then the next one, that's Steve sitting there, 7 million and me living in fuel poverty. So that was an action designed to do that. And we created this little film, which I think you're going to get a list of things to read or think about. And there was this film telling the story of Insulate Britain. Okay. So Insulate Britain acted for about 6 weeks before leading up to COP26. And then they had to stop because National Highways put injunctions on the roads, and injunctions are civil actions, which meant that people could be fined huge amounts of money because they were not doing, they were trespassing on private property. The roads, motorways don't belong to us, they belong to National Highways. Here we are outside the Royal Courts of Justice, waiting. If you do the next slide. Yes, more people waiting. And then the next slide. This group of people are about to go into court because they have broken the injunction and they were going to be tried for doing that. So there's these 9 people here, and they were all sent to prison. Go back one, please. So they were all sent to prison for 4 months, 5 months, some of them, and just for sitting on the road, basically, causing disruption to the traffic, but not massively so. And because they were breaking this civil injunction. And I was a prison buddy for Ben, who's back over on the right, the little one with the red hair, and various other people were prison buddies. And being a prison buddy is, again, another thing that people could easily do. It's a really important, good thing. It's corporal work of mercy, as you'll all know. And so these people were in prison for a while. And then, as well as that, they were in a normal kind of court, a Crown Court, for public nuisance, for trespass and things like that. And at the beginning of those trials, here, this is a trial with 4 of them. This is Sue over on the right, who was the one that I first met. And this is her friend Ruth, who was one of the founders of Christian Climate Action. This is Ben that you've seen before. And this is somebody who's called Christian. And because he was called Christian, he somehow seemed to get wrapped up with the rest of us. Anyway, so these 4 were in court together, accused of public nuisance. And because they were able to some extent talk about the climate, they actually managed to, they were found not guilty, which was obviously a great delight, but not to the judge. And the judge was obviously quite upset that they were found not guilty. And over time, he made greater and greater restrictions on what people could say about the climate. And although people argued, I remember Sue saying, if we're meant to tell the whole truth, surely we should also be able to talk about the climate as well as about the actual actions that we did and about ourselves. And he would say, well, climate's not really relevant. And there was a great debate about that, but there were more and more restrictions the judges brought in as to what people could say. You can move on, Peter. And so somebody called Trudy Warner went and sat outside that in a London Crown Court with this notice, which you can see me sitting here with it, about the right of juries to give the verdict according to their convictions. And that's a plaque on the Old Bailey, which refers back to a trial in the 17th century, where some Quakers were preaching when they shouldn't preach, and they were found not guilty, and the judge didn't like that, and he locked them up, and they still said they were not guilty, not guilty, not guilty, and eventually the judge gave in, and so this plaque on Bailey is commemorating that. And Trudy went and sat outside the inner London Crown Court as Silas Reed was gradually restricting things more and more, and with this plaque, and he had her arrested, and she ended up in the Old Bailey site, ironically, and they decided that she had to go to be tried properly, and she was tried in the Royal Courts of Justice, and the judge there said, no, she wasn't interrupting, she wasn't trying to influence the jury, she was just telling them a fact, which was a known fact. She was like a human billboard. But since then, a group called Defend Our Juries has sat outside a lot of Crown Court trials with these notices, just to remind juries that they can make up their own minds. They don't have to do exactly what the judge tells them. Okay, so if we move on. And then there were a whole series of other trials, including a very big one where Roger Hallam, that some of you will have heard of, and 4 other people were found guilty and given enormous sentences, 5 years and 4 years. And here we are sitting outside the Royal Courts of Justice when there was an appeal to try and reduce the sentence. And hundreds of us, I mean, literally hundreds of us, sat outside the Royal Courts of Justice to show that we really, really cared about this. And police came along. You can just see a policeman here saying, we might arrest you soon. You really ought not to be here. And we just sat there silent for well over an hour. And the police wandered about, but they couldn't do anything. It was a very, very powerful witness to try and to influence what was going on inside. And in the end, the appeal was partly successful. Their sentences were reduced a little bit, not very much, but at least a bit. Okay. So here, this is a picnic, as you can see. At the same time as people were taking action on sorry, I should go back a bit. Just Stop Oil had formed by then, because after Insulate Britain, people were saying, well, you shouldn't be sitting on the motorways, you should be going and taking action on the oil refineries and people who are involved in that. And so that's what people started to do. And they took action outside the oil refineries, and then the oil refineries created injunctions so that people couldn't go there. And then various people went to petrol stations, and this little group went to a petrol station, and again they blocked the petrol station, and a couple of them smashed 2 petrol pumps. And this little group have just been on trial recently and were found not guilty of a public nuisance, but they were found guilty of criminal damage for smashing the petrol pumps. And that Phil over to the right here with a cheery smile is again a member of Christian Climate Action. He's a very, very principled Quaker, and he walked to his trial from where he lives in Fareham to Guildford, which is where the trial was, as again a sort of witness and telling people what he was doing, why he was doing it. But so there are still a huge number of court cases from all these various actions that people took, and the criminal justice system is pretty well clogged up at the moment in Britain, and so there are people with trials in 2026, 2027. It's really pretty grim for them. But meanwhile, one of the things that happened as a result of our walking to Glasgow was that we set up a group called Exile Walkers. And walk fairly regularly every month. So if people want to do that, they could do that. And one of the ideas that came out of one of the walks was that we should act against the National Trust and try and persuade them to stop banking with Barclays, which is, you probably know, a bank that really funds fossil fuels hugely. And so we went to the National Trust AGM, which is what we're doing here outside the Steam Museum, and some people went inside, and we had a motion to try and persuade the National Trust to stop banking with Barclays. Didn't work, but they were listening. So that's one of the kind of actions. And then another more gentle kind of action is pilgrimages. So this is a pilgrim flag. You can't really see CCA flag. And the next couple of pictures are, here's a pilgrimage walking along the Thames. You can see us going past Tower Bridge and walking past various things. There's a lovely varied group here. You can see there's a group of Buddhists at the front, one of them in a sort of robe. And here we are, and below a statue of Peter the Great, who came to Britain in the 17th, 18th century to find out about warships. So even then we were exporting arms. We export arms now, but even then we were exporting arms. So we walked along the Thames that Peter does the next picture, and here we are at the Thames Barrier with a whole nother group, and you'll see and in the background is the Thames Barrier. And one of the reasons we wanted to come to the Thames Barrier was the Thames Barrier has been raised and lowered many more times than it was originally intended to. And so that's a bit of a problem, really. And pilgrimage is a really lovely way of taking action. It's another, it's a very visible form of protest, but a very gentle form of protest. And you can see there's a lot of people looking very pleased that they managed several miles to show that they care about the climate in particular ways. Different action. This is us in Downing Street. This is Helen Burnett that I think I mentioned before, and she is an Anglican minister, and we are holding a Eucharist outside Downing Street in the middle of Whitehall. And I have to say, some of the most moving Eucharists I've been to have been this kind of outdoor protest Eucharist. So if you show the next picture, you can see there's Helen again with the communion table in front of her and a group of us participating. So that's another form of protest, and a different form of protest. Here we are, this is outside Parliament, a group of us sitting in vigil, and CCA come and sit in vigil outside Parliament every Wednesday lunchtime when it's Prime Minister's questions. People walk past, ask us what we're doing. We have an opportunity to talk to them, talk to all sorts of different people. And then sometimes we stay a bit longer, and we've had vigils overnight. So this is a vigil for climate justice. And there's a nice picture next, I think, of us huddled up, sitting there right through the night in sleeping bags and blankets and things to keep ourselves warm. And then by this time, we're on to fairly recent times, and you'll be aware of the war in Gaza, Israel, and the huge Palestine marches that there have been. And there is there's often a Christian bloc. This is a Christian bloc that was going to join the Palestine march. And the next slide shows a little group of us. So there's me, there's Helen. Some of you might know there's Pat Gaffney from Pax Christi. So there's a Pax Christi group as well. And these couple of others, the friends that are CCA people as well. And with signs, very Christian signs. So that's another thing we do. And then we also work with other organizations and Rosebank is a huge oil field in the North Sea, which had a license, and then the license has been suspended because the way in which they'd applied it, they hadn't taken account of all the emissions that it would produce. And so they have had to apply again, and they're in the middle of applying. And we've had a campaign to say that they should not get a license. So here we are. This is in Trafalgar Square, and I think there should be another slide in a minute. Sorry, that's a Palestine banner, but we've also been talking about that. But the next one, we went and stood outside Labour HQ quite regularly before the election. And then when they got in, we went to be there. This is Keir Starmer driving into Buckingham Palace to be appointed Prime Minister. And we managed to get our banner rather beautifully at the back so that he could see. And we're waiting at the moment to see whether the government will approve the license or not. So that's the end of what I wanted to say. I just want to say again, that CCA is a non-violent organisation. We do a lot of different things. We're very peaceful. And that's sort of really very much in our DNA, that we do that. And a friend has talked about the ecology of protest, and I think you'll have seen from what I've said, a whole range of different things in which ways in which one can protest. Yeah, there we are.
I realise that we are quite a lot over time, and I will try and make this as quick as I can so that we can have some time for some discussions. I'm just going to screen share myself. I hope this works. Here we go. So I can't do this sophisticated PowerPoint because I'm on an iPad and it just doesn't let me do that. So I just wanted to start by quickly telling you about my journey into climate activism. It's one of the things I was asked to talk about, and I think that there's something really, for me, certainly very meaningful in the way I came into this, but I hope it'll be meaningful to others. When Sue introduced me, she told you that I was a lawyer, and I am a lawyer. And in 2019, in April 2019, I was on my way to court in my suit, and I saw this group of people on Waterloo Bridge, and they were still there on my way back. And so I stopped, partly because I was a nosy lawyer and they were being arrested. And I saw this group here that you can see in this photo. It was just extraordinary. There were people sort of peacefully waiting to be arrested and just not resisting the arrest. And I was just really taken by that. And then I realized that something was saying to me that I needed to be on the other side of the police lines. And I did. I walked across in my suit, and I can only think now that this was God telling me that this was the next step in my life. Because when I walked over those police lines into this crowd on the bridge, I'm just going to move to the next sort of photo that I've got. What I found was a group of people who was something nearer the kingdom of God than I had seen in any church. And we pray regularly, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, thy will be done. And it's this, we say the Lord's Prayer almost without thinking. And for the first time, I think, in my life, I found people bringing the kingdom of God to earth. These were people who were doctors and nurses and homeless people. There was a kitchen there feeding everybody. And this bridge, which normally had traffic and fumes, had been turned into a garden. And I saw a vision of what we could be. And I have never looked back. We haven't been able to recreate that
again, I kind of naively underestimated the ferocity with which I think we could call the powers and principalities would rise in opposition to this idea. But I've seen, and I know what we can be. And that for me was the beginning of my journey into activism and what I suppose Pope Francis describes as ecological conversion, this metanoia. Up to that point, I had gone to church on Sundays. I had sort of had half an ear to social justice. I'd never really understood it. And I was in real danger of just taking my faith for granted. I was kind of losing it. I discovered there were Christians involved in this protest. I joined them. And in the journey over the last 5 or 6 years, my faith has deepened to a point where I can really feel that I am part of something important, this journey towards God. So in the months that followed, I took this sign that I saw in April 2019 quite seriously. I signed up for a master's in theology, ecology, and ethics that was co-created by the Jesuits in Britain. And I combined that with an increasing involvement in Christian climate action. And that led me to a position where this is me, love is action. And I realized that my legal work needed to be just enough to pay the bills. And I only do it for a day or two a week, just enough to pay the bills. And I have no doubt that God has called me into this work, not just because creation was in peril, but because I've been given this chance to live a life of richness and relationship and challenge beyond anything I imagined possible. I thought as I reached retirement, I might sit on the sofa with a cup of cocoa, and I don't. And that lifestyle change, well, I'm not going to be honest here. It was a sacrifice, and it's a sacrifice that I have made not just on my behalf, because I have reaped incredible reward from this, but also my family. And it may be something that when we come to the discussion, we might want to talk about. My youngest son was only 15 when I began this journey. And I think they have paid a price that maybe we are not always honest about, but maybe we should think about that. So I just want to also talk a little bit about CCA, because Barbara's introduced this, but I want to tell you that we're people with a range of views on different subjects, very much like you are here in Root and Branch. But what we agree on is the existential threat posed by the climate and environmental crisis, and the need for systemic measures to address it. So many of us are involved in lifestyle changes, and that's important to us. But really, we accept, I think, that we need to change the system if we are going to manage to address this threat to humanity and to, in fact, all life on Earth, this gift of creation that we've received. And we also agree that on the importance of a range of nonviolent direct action in achieving that systemic change. And that's why we do some of the things we do. And Barbara has told you about it, and it ranges from the peaceful protests and the one outside Lambeth Palace that Barbara told you about. We're actually quite blunt in our messaging. I firmly believe that climate action inaction is racism, because of the way that the climate change affects people in the global south, people who are black and brown primarily. But we also tackle this idea that there is greed in humanity, and it's killing us. There's the greed of corporate structures. And direct action, as Barbara said, that includes civil disobedience. That's a real key part in our NVDA toolkit. Only a minority of people take that, but we say that you need to be able to accept that they do. And the last thing I want to talk about is this. So let's see if we can give you that. On the 1st of September, at the beginning of the season of creation, we launched Stop Crucifying Creation, which is a document that calls for radical change within the Church of England in particular to protect creation in the face of climate breakdown. Now, it's directed at the Church of England because that's the state church, and it holds a particular power and responsibility because of its position. It has a very local parish network, but it also has bishops in the House of Lords, and it's one of the country's largest landowners. But I would say that it's not just the Church of England. I'd suggest that every church, every institution, organisation, leader, every individual needs to embody the values that are reflected in this vision. It's a matter of our common good and our flourishing as human beings. And so I'm going to invite you to visit our website and to read this document and to see how you might be able to put it into practice in your church structures and your organizations. And it calls on the church to find its courage so that it can speak out prophetically and persistently about climate change. And so it can start taking radical, non-violent action following what we believe to be the example of Jesus. And it calls on the church to stop doing harm to the planet through its own activities, exposing the vested interests that fuel the climate crisis and the nature crisis, which often are reflected in the church's investment decisions. And we call on the church to return to its roots of prayer and confession and building a loving community as we face climate breakdown. So that really almost brings me to the end of what I want to say. Just when you visit our website, have a look for this. This is our National Day of Climate Prayer, and it's at various cathedral locations in England and Wales, primarily because we're addressing this to the Church of England. But you might be able to think and look at the resources that we offer and think about how we can offer this in the Catholic context in particular. And so, yeah, that's me. I hope I've been quick enough. I'm really sorry if we've run over and cut into the discussion time.
Thank you, Melanie.
Let me just stop the screen share.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I'll spotlight Barbara and Rhiannon, and then she'll start our quick Q&A question now.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Melanie, and thank you, Barbara. That was fantastic. And no, do not apologise for speaking for speaking as long as you did. We needed to hear that. It's fantastic. I'm going to ask you now to raise your electronic hand if you can, please, if you're able to ask a question. My colleagues will be scanning the chat because sometimes people post their questions in the chat or their statements with a questioning tone, and we'll be able to include some of those as well. So please, questions, observations as well, please, for Melanie and or Barbara. It might help if you want to ask Melanie or Barbara, if you know which of our two friends here you'd like to ask a question to. Perhaps you could address it to them. Otherwise, I guess they'll decide between them who initially responds to your question or observation. And I've got a hand up from Kevin. Hi, Kevin.
Yeah, hello. My question would be addressed to both Barbara and to Melanie. I'm incredibly impressed by the action, but one thing that comes across to me is the incredible cost that is paid. Going to prison means a criminal record, which you then have to declare on all sorts of application forms that can affect employment, perhaps for the rest of your life. You've given up your career, Melanie, right? There's a cost there, right? Financial, and I'm sure in other ways. It's just that this comes at a price, doesn't it? Raising your voice, standing up is not free. Maybe what's coming up for me also is the message of the cross. In this, when you do these things, does the cross appear? That's my question.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that neither Melanie nor I have been in prison. I mean, Melanie clearly couldn't practice as a barrister if she had been, and I haven't either. I help people, support people, but maybe the part of the answer is that one of our friends, Sue Parfitt, has written. It's called Bodies on the Line, which is about that kind of sacrifice that people perhaps do have to make in the facing the crisis that there is. I think Melanie wants to add to that.
Yeah, I would say that this is one of the most existential crises facing humanity in not just living memory, but in a very, very long time. And in some ways more serious than the last World War, because it affects the whole of humanity and the whole of creation. And if we take our faith seriously, then we really have to think what we do to address that. And not everybody will believe that nonviolent direct action is the way to do it. We think that if you don't follow this quite dramatic path, then people tend to sweep it under the carpet, and nobody thinks about the seriousness of it. Nobody's willing to really address that. Part of that is borne out in the fact that we get press whenever we do, particularly in your face things that we don't when we just do our vigils and our walks and that kind of thing. But yes, sacrifice is part of this. We are all going to have to make sacrifices in one way or another. And it's where your line is. And that's something for every individual. You have to discern that for yourself. You have to ask God where that is. And I believe that God opens the doors that we are asked to walk through. And we don't all have the same path. Have our path. And that this is mine. And the other thing is that we talk about sacrifice, we often don't think about the richness that it brings to our lives. And that's the other side. And maybe that's part of the idea of the cross. There is resurrection beyond it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Kevin, thanks. That's, God opens the doors that we are asked to pass through. I'll be thinking about that one. Thank you for offering that, Melanie. And Olive, you're next up. Hi, Olive.
Hi. Thank you for what you were saying. Thank you for what you're doing. But there's a point in the chat about Mary thinks that disrupting people's lives by blocking roads and courts is unacceptable. And this is something that I've frequently had discussion. I've never joined one of these disruptive things. One of the things about living in Devon, getting up to London to disrupt is a bit difficult. The trains don't work very well. But, if you just do, when you disrupt things, you get reported and people actually hear what's going on. Quiet vigils and walks certainly have a place and should not be denigrated. But a few years ago, in one of the early seasons of creation that the Church of England were running, we're living in a village in North Somerset, and we ran a whole series of events and talks, and we did them at different times of the day. We did them at weekends, we did them at evenings, and the attendances were universally retired people. And on the Saturday morning, there was a very interesting talk being given by a climate scientist. And I was walking down to it and I was going across the football field and all the dads were standing around chatting because the boys were playing football. And I stopped and chatted and I said, why haven't you come to any of these? And they said, we haven't got time because on Monday we do this, on Tuesday we drive our children to that, on Wednesday we drive our children to this. Every evening they are in the cars driving their children to something else. And they didn't actually care. So we're talking about a generation, the older people seem to be working very hard, maybe to undo the damage that we have done in the previous 70 years of our lives. But we seem to be more conscious of it than the 30, 40, 50-year-olds. And I'm not making a universal thing. And I find it very dispiriting when, I meet 40-somethings that are going on 3 or 4 flying holidays every year. End of rant.
Thank you, Olive. Would Melanie or Barbara want to respond?
Just a couple of
Versus
things, really.
It wasn't a rant, Olive.
One is that a lot of young people are involved in these protests, these big protests, because they see the threat much more clearly than those of us who are older, I think, quite often. So there tend to be 2 groups. One is very young and the other is quite old. So you'll have seen the huge sit-ins outside Parliament last Saturday and a couple of weeks before. Half of the people who were arrested then were over 60. because they also could see what might happen, and they wanted to act, and they could do so with relative impunity because they didn't have a job to worry about and so on. But yes, that's why you do very disruptive action, because it makes people notice.
Mm.
I would say this, though, in defense of people who are 30 and 40. Life these days is very hard. I think it's actually harder than it was when I was 30 and 40. It's much more demanding. I think that's to do with the job market and the economics and all the other crises that we face, many of them connected in with the climate crisis. And certainly the climate crisis will make them all worse. But also, they are fed a diet on TV, in the newspapers, everything that sets up this kind of aspiration for growth, for more, for consumption. And we just got to work out how we tackle that. I don't think we can just... blame is not the right word, but I think we have to offer them choices. And this is why systemic change is so important. We have to create a system where it is easy for people to make good choices.
Yes. Systemic change. Thank you. Is that okay, Olive? Thank you for
Yeah, I mean, having mentioned growth, I read a short while ago, that growth was a metric invented by the economist in the OECD. And I'm thinking, why is this metric the one that's used to judge the value or how good a government is? Can we find some alternative metrics and really work to get an alternative metric to growth, economic growth? You know, if we could push the whole people are happier, people are more content, etc., etc. And you know, maybe that is something we should be looking to do.
A well-being index, yeah.
Yeah, and really get rid of this growth fixation.
God calls us to flourish, and flourishing is about well-being, not just about whether you can afford a certain type of food on your table or whether you can fly on your next holiday.
Yeah, agree with you. Anyway, you've got
Thank you for raising that question just now, Olive, and maybe economics is we need to have a themed meeting around economics, and I think we'll call on you actually, Olive, if we go down that road. Thank you, Christina. Welcome.
Yes, good morning from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Apologies for my attire. I'm just actually sitting in bed because it's still very early in the morning and it's my sleeping morning. Anyway, Melanie, I'm drawn to your African, Indian and Pacific connections, and I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I know the Solomon Islands, a small independent Pacific and Commonwealth nation, very well. I've worked there as a volunteer and then coordinating volunteers to work in Solomon Islands, as well as Papua New Guinea and other nations in the Pacific. What do you see as the connection between colonialism, and emerging Indigenous peoples' movements and care of the earth?
Wow, that's a big one.
Yes.
I think colonialism is responsible not just for extraction and for robbing a lot of countries of their ability to really manage the adaptation of climate change because they're economically vulnerable now. Less so in some ways in the Pacific because there wasn't the resources that they took in the same way as they took in Africa. But what colonialism has done is given the world an amazingly extractive mindset and a particular economic mindset that defeats what we tend to find. Sorry, was somebody asking something further? No. Well, I think we tend to find in Indigenous cultures, including in the Pacific, a much more generous and open culture, one that tends to accept gift, including the gift of nature, much more readily. And we've set about destroying a lot of that. I'm really impressed at the way the Pacific Islands have come fighting back on climate change, because they're some of the most vulnerable nations, particularly to sea level rise, but also to overfishing and to food security issues as climate changes. But there are cases recently in the ICJ and the ruling that states owe a duty of climate care to their citizens, I think will prove to be really important. But the Indigenous mindset, I think, going back to your question, is one that we should all look more closely at. I'm a big fan of Robin Wall Kimmerer's work. And if you haven't read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I really recommend it. You can read it in short bits and it's an Indigenous American First Nations culture, but not entirely different to the Indigenous cultures that you find in other parts of the world. And I have a daughter in New Zealand permanently. It's hard because when your family live halfway across the world and you don't fly to see them, then, but she loves it there.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
I mean, I find the Māori Renaissance in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a cause for huge hope because they emphasise the connectivity of everything, of our past, present and future, decolonisation, connection with the earth and care of the earth, building communities, all of that is all connected. And so, it's very inspiring, and I do see the future of the earth is in First Nations peoples. So we need to be hearing the voices of Africa, of Asian peoples, of First Nations peoples globally. So yes, so thank you for that.
It's interesting to see an enculturated church in places as well, and also to see churches in the Pacific, which has become a very, very Christian place, taking a lead on some of this climate work. In Tonga, for instance, which I think is part of the Diocese of Aotearoa and Polynesia, they've been mapping climate resilience.
They're independent.
Right.
Yes.
They've been mapping climate resilience within small communities through churches and young church people, and building that resilience and looking at where the risks lie and what skills the communities have to address them. It's really impressive work.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions.
Can you put that book in the chat so we get the title of it, please?
Yes, let me do that now.
Great, thank you.
I'm glad you mentioned small islands because despite their minimal contribution to emissions, the climate crisis, as you were saying, Melanie, poses an existential threat, particularly, doesn't it, to small island communities. So thanks for raising those points, Christina. Over to Mary now. Hi, Mary.
Hi. Just to ask briefly, Melanie, particularly perhaps following on from Christina's point, where does the concept in Bhutan of gross national happiness or gross domestic happiness, does that play a very great part in any of the rest of the world's thinking? I think it still persists in Bhutan, but any comment on that? As it seems to me, it's what every single one of our countries should be doing.
I don't know a lot about it, but I think it is a good step away from pure GDP. Barbara, do you know more about it? The Wellbeing Index in Bhutan? I mean, it's one of the few countries, I think, that does it.
Yeah. It just seems so powerful to me, so simple and so obvious, but it doesn't seem to gain traction.
No.
But perhaps there's time yet. Thank you. Rhiannon, you're muted, lovely.
Apologise. I don't know if my colleagues have spotted any questions from the chat that they'd like to sound out, but we do have time for one or two more questions if we keep them brief, if that's okay. Fairly brief. Anyone else? Or has anyone spotted anything in the chat, colleague?
There is
Mary?
There is a point made earlier, which I think probably is a fairly widespread point made by Mary Wilkinson. Olive referred to it.
Yeah.
And it just goes back to the point about disruption. But may I take it that you've answered it by saying that unless people are disrupted, they simply won't notice? Is that your feeling, Barbara and Melanie?
It's not the only way, but it is a very powerful way, put it that way. I mean, for instance, we had hundreds and hundreds of people outside Parliament for a whole weekend celebrating the climate and thinking about it and what we might do about it. And there was just nothing in the press at all. And then you have a few people sitting in a road for 10 minutes and it's all over the papers. So there is that balance to be struck, I think. I've described quite a lot of the peaceful things we do, and they have had notice, some of them, but nowhere near as much as the very disruptive actions.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
One example might be, it doesn't apply across the board, and a lot of this is about press attention, but Insulate Britain, which Barbara showed you photographs of, was really, really disruptive and really unpopular when it closed the motorways. And I remember, I personally find, I don't take these actions, but they are very costly to the people involved, and people have spent a lot of time in prison for them. And I wondered whether it was worth it. It took some time, but when all that noise went away, underlying it was a change in the way that we viewed the need to insulate Britain's housing stock. And that, for me, has been one of the most impactful examples, is what has happened, how it has shifted that discourse about that and what people actually do. And so, yeah, I think that it's not anything that any of us want to be doing, but sometimes you just, the consequences of not doing that kind of thing is the potential for huge suffering if we don't tackle these issues. Suffering that outweighs the disruption hugely. And it's suffering that won't necessarily be borne by us. We inflict it on people in climate vulnerable countries, primarily in the global south. And we need to take that really seriously. So the disruption to our lives is difficult, but think about what is happening to the people who live in climate vulnerable countries. And that is our responsibility. Historically, it's our responsibility. It's connected all the way back to slavery. We have managed to fund the Industrial Revolution, export it, bought good things, it brought the climate crisis. So, I think we have to look at it through that lens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. There's a hand up from Olive. Did you want to respond to that point, Olive?
No, I was going to throw in something new and thinking about Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah.
And you say that humanity is in danger of extinction rather than saving the planet. And people say, yes, but there have been many extinction events in the past, so why should we stop the next one happening?
Do you want to take that, Barbara?
Well, you're right. Probably most of us won't be there to suffer, but and the planet will survive. Actually, the planet will survive.
Absolutely.
But the planet will survive. But on the whole, I would like to have a world in which my children and grandchildren can carry on living, and their children, and that's partly why I do what I do. Yeah.
I'm going to offer a slightly more theological perspective, I think, and a realistic one. My theological perspective on this is that it is human hubris. God gave us a gift. If this extinction, and a natural extinction is due, if God thinks the time for the world to end has come, that is not our decision. And we as humanity are bringing about this extinction. And it has happened before, but not at the rate that we're seeing, the extinction of species. And I think that is something that my faith tells me is clearly wrong, that actually this is not God's will. That's the first part of it. The second is the suffering that is going to come as our climate breaks down, as we live in this way of chaos, is also something that God, it just goes against the idea of God's love for creation. We're going to be seeing wars about resources. We're going to see human suffering and migration at a level we've never seen before. We begin to see a bit of it when we see the fighting that's going on in the Middle East. that is connected with resource allocations and fear and safety and all those complicated things that the climate crisis brings. And that is so against the will of God. We believe in a God of love and justice and flourishing. I do. Then we have to do something to bring about that kingdom.
Thank you.
So, yeah, sorry, that's blunt.
It has to be. It has to be in this conversation. It has to be very blunt.
Yeah.
When a scientist told me that the soil in this country will support another 40 to 45 harvests, and I'm thinking the soil will be totally depleted before my eldest grandson retires. That is a terrifying thought. That really frightens me for him, for the rest of my grandchildren.
Gosh, thank you, Olive. That's huge. Thank you. I think we've probably come now to the end of our questions. I was going to try to squeeze in one about, but if I could just make a point, if that's okay. Forgive me. I'm glad you mentioned extinction and species. I think it was Melanie. It's likely, isn't it, that species exposed to greater climate change are going to become more extinct. And I was going to ask a question around that, but I'm glad that we've mentioned species and extinction, how
Yes.
hugely important that is. Thank you. Sue, hi.
Well, technically, how to thank this extraordinary presentation. Because you have told us so many different things that are happening, but also the vision that you have and the importance of it. So, and talking through all your non-violent actions and linking it to Christian message, actually, particularly as well, and showing how people are prepared to go to prison, and how you support those who are in prison, and what Sue Parfitt said, I thought was particularly interesting. An elderly retired vicar, I think she is, who's go to prison 20 times and said that the whole truth is that we have to tell the truth about climate change. So, we can't just we have to make an impact is what you're trying to do, and you do it in extraordinary different ways. I thought the outdoor Eucharist and the prayer vigils offered to give a special spiritual support, and I think that's really important because it's a different kind of witness and different vision of what could happen, and mentioning particularly how what we call the majority world, the world south of the equator, how that is affected, and we have to kind of make people aware of it and have a different approach to growth and everything, really. So we give profound thanks and respect for all that you've shown us, and that love is action. And thank you so much for your actions. Okay, thank you.
This is the point where we introduce our future events. And we have two coming up very soon. First one from John Rosebank. I'll introduce it just by first saying something we've all heard. And upon this rock, I will build my church. How many times have we heard that? And there, so we have it. Nice and simple, nothing to worry about, all nice and clear. Peter was the first Bishop of Rome. We have the apostolic succession of men, and here we are today with Pope Leo, the head of our church. Right. And so we buy it.
Different.
Yes, sorry.
Different.
And so
it passed out.
Sorry, some background noise, right? And so we buy this message, hook, line, right, and sinker. But was it really like this? Have we been led down some kind of Vatican garden path? Well, according to John Rosebank, we have well and truly been led down this false road. The New Testament never mentions Peter as the Bishop of Rome, and St. Paul's letters to the Roman Church omits him entirely. So what's going on? Where does the truth lie? The idea we have been fed that a continuous, unbroken line of papal authority appears to be more theological than historical. is not for me to argue. Let's leave it to John Rosebank, who has researched it deeply and will join us in Root and Branch on the 30th of October at 8 p.m. to say more about this explosive news and research. John is an Oxford scholar and well versed in historical research, working on documentaries, both of the BBC and Channel 4. He has said that time traveling back into the 4th century for this piece of research was one of the most uncomfortable things he has ever done. So please, this explosive topic is something not to miss at the end of October. Following on from that, we're also blessed on the 4th of December, again at 8 p.m. UK time, to be joined by contemporary theologian Dermot Omocho. Dermot was educated in Trinity College, Dublin, and is from the Sacred Heart Missionary Order. His speciality is in spirituality that is evolutionary, a spirituality that is for today, for the present day, that integrates everything that is from the world and is embedded into the present world. And it comes with a concern for the present world, the ecological crisis, immigration, and so on. Dermot's talk will carry the stimulating and refreshing title of Reworking the Tradition, Implications for Our Time. One of Dermot's quotes is, when it comes to ordination, God has no favourite gender. I think that sentence will give you a flavour for the evening. So please let the 4th of December be another date for your diaries. Thanks for that. And I hand over to Mary Ring for our final prayer.
Thank you, Kevin. May the sun bring you new energy by day. May the moon softly restore you by night. May the rain wash away your worries. May the breeze blow new strength into your being. May you walk gently through the world and know its beauty all the days of your life. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a powerfully thought-provoking evening. Thank you all for coming.